Okay. 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 Maybe it went over to the Senate. Please stand for the invocation and pledge.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day, Lord. Lord, you just bless us so much day by day. Lord, it's just please be with this council as we make our decisions, that our decisions will honor you. Lord, just be with each one of us throughout this week and keep us safe. In your name, amen.
Amen. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd like to call this February 18th meeting to order. Amend the agenda.
Mayor, we need to amend the agenda to add a voting item in reference to House Bill 581, whether to opt out or not. Make a motion to do that.
Make a motion to amend the agenda to add a voting item for House Bill.
All in favor? Show of hands.
But just to be clear, the motion was made by Councilmember Penn, seconded by Councilmember Patterson.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. Now,
All in favor? Okay.
Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to amend the agenda to add a proclamation for Georgia Arbor Day for February 21st.
I need a second.
I'll second that.
All in favor? Show of hands. Thank you. So we've made those changes to the agenda. Voting item number 3 will be HB 581, and voting item number 4 will be the proclamation read. Okay. I need to go on into the minute approval, and I'm needing the February 4th, 2025 public hearing and work session, and the February 12th public hearing minutes. I need a motion for their approval.
Make a motion to approve February 4th and February 12th minutes.
I'll second.
Tim, second. All in favor, show of hands. The minutes have been approved. We need to have a motion to go into our public hearing. I need someone to make a motion.
I'll make a motion to go in public hearing.
That's it.
Okay. All in favor, show of hands. Okay. This is the last one, too.
Is that right?
Okay.
Great way to start the public hearing. Mayor and council, members of the public, I apologize in advance if this is the second or third time you've heard this presentation. I'm going to do my best to go faster this time. but still cover House Bill 581. Again, this is a presentation, some of which, a large part of this, which was taken from a presentation prepared by GMA and ACCG, but this has been tailored to Statham specifically and to discuss some specific nuances here in the city that we need to keep in mind as far as House Bill 581. So House Bill 581 was adopted by the General Assembly during the 2024 session. The issue that they were attempting to address was the impact of steep property assessments year over year that had been causing large property tax increases throughout the state of Georgia, and it was particularly causing problems within the senior citizen population and those living on fixed incomes, because as you can imagine, an increase in your property tax bill on a fixed income obviously eats away pretty quickly at household spending, and that was causing several regions and cities to experience loss of properties, tax sales for unpaid taxes. Senate and the House had two different approaches for how they wanted to tackle this problem. The Senate wanted to put in place a ceiling, basically a way of controlling the growth of property assessments, the valuations year over year. The House wanted to look at ways to expand sales taxes and to try to shift local government funding for maintenance and obligation from property taxes and more towards sales. 581 was the compromise. It kind of blended both of those two approaches. It was very popular in the House and in the Senate. It passed the House 164-2. It passed the Senate 52-0 and was signed by the governor on April 18th of 2024. In order for House Bill 581 to become effective, however, because it has statewide ramifications for property taxes and because it is considered not an infringement, that's the wrong word, but a reduction in a city or a local governing authority's home rule powers, it required a constitutional amendment. That constitutional amendment was adopted by the voters by a vote of 63 to 37, not 73. It was, as I'm not surprised by that result, as you've heard me say twice now. Constitutional referendums, generally speaking, are massive oversimplifications, and that's just the nature of the beast. It's hard to distill 27 pages worth of complex tax legislation into a single question. And frankly, the way that it is worded, I hate to say it, I don't know any constitutional referendum that has ever been different. It definitely leads to a conclusion, and this is no difference. And in fact, if you want my honest opinion, 63-37 was a much smaller margin than I was expecting. I was expecting somewhere in the 80 to 20 range. But the law became effective on January 1st of 2025. So that is, in effect, as we sit here right now, it is the law of the land. So we're going to go over three major components to the legislation. The first is the statewide floating homestead exemption. We're going to be spending most time on that because that is what the Senate's vision was for putting a cap on assessments. The second is a new local option sales tax, which was created to be the funding mechanism, a way of making sure that cities and municipalities and counties did not suffer massive revenue loss, and there would be a mechanism by which they could make up the loss of ad valorem tax revenue that they would experience year over year as a result of House Bill 581 and the floating homestead exemption. And then the third section is going to be talking about just some procedural changes. This is more informative for y'all and for the members of the public. So we'll start with a statewide floating homestead exemption. What is it? Here's what the first thing you need to know and understand. To understand how your ad valorem property tax bill is calculated, it's a simple equation. It's a mathematical formula that requires two variables. Variable number one is the assessed value of your home. That is not the same thing as the fair market value of your home for two reasons. Number one, generally speaking, tax valuations are not nearly as scientifically accurate as if an appraiser is going out there for some kind of bank transaction or a sales transaction. But more importantly, assessed value is 40% of the value that they set. So for example, if your home is valued at $250,000, the assessed value will be 40% of that, or $100,000. The assessed value is what matters because that is what the millage rate is applied to. That gets me to my second part of the formula, which is the millage rate, equivalent of a tax rate. It's the percentage that is opposed against the assessed value to arrive at your property tax bill. And as you've seen, there can be multiple jurisdictions imposing millage rates. Every citizen in the city of Statham has actually three definitive ones. There's the county portion of the taxes, there's the city portion of the taxes, and then there's school portion of the taxes. Each of them get to assess millage rates. Homestead exemptions are created and established by the taxing authority and are applied against the property's valuation prior to the application of a millage rate. What I analogize this to is on your federal income taxes, you have your you get your income, your total income that you receive every single year, right? And then you have a bunch of deductions that are applied against that, and you arrive at something called adjusted gross income, AGI. And that's what you're taxed on, your AGI. Homestead exemptions function the same way. You have your assessed value, and then the homestead exemption is applied, and then the number that is left afterward, that is what the millage rate is applied to. House Bill 581 does not affect variable number 2. It does not put a cap on millage rates. Millage rates can go up and down to the need to meet the needs of the municipality or the taxing authority. House Bill 581 only affects the assessed value component of this equation. How does it do it? So it uses a two-step process to offset the impact of property value increases. Step 1 is it creates a statewide exemption, a statewide deduction, if you will. It is designed to offset the increases in taxable value, and it floats. It never is the same in year to year. And I'll explain why that's the case in a minute. The step 2 is it caps property value increases at the rate of inflation. This is what we call the inflationary factor. This was a mechanism put into the legislation to make sure that cities and counties are able to capture some, but not all, of the value increases. So basically it puts an artificial ceiling so that even though property values may go above that ceiling, the assessed value will never go above that ceiling. And again, I'm going to use examples to show how that works. So let's focus on step 1 first, which is the floating exemption. And we're going to use an example to show you how it works. Property A has a taxable value. This is an assessed value. So the 40% of $100,000 in year 1. In year 2, that value increases due to natural market conditions by $10,000. Your new value, assessed value, is $110,000. Now the reality is, in my example, it would actually be a $40,000 increase. But we're going to use $10,000 as an easy number to use. The homestead exemption would float and be worth $10,000 of taxable value. So once you apply the exemption, that new year 2 assessed value of 110, subtract the homestead exemption, and you see that you are paying the same $100,000 assessed value that you were paying in year 1. So the net effect is you set a base year valuation and it doesn't move. The exemption will float upwards and continue to move to make sure that there's no additional taxes or assessed value that you're penalized on. So for example, in year 3, let's say it goes up by another $5,000. Your exemption now goes from $10,000 to $15,000 because again, we're tracking year 1. We don't want you to suffer the pain of that $15,000 increase in assessed value. Step 2 is the inflationary adjustment. This is where we're going to put a little caveat here, and we're going to allow cities and counties to capture some of the increase in value. So it authorizes the taxing authority to increase the base year value by a rate of inflation determined by the state revenue commissioner. Now, there's a couple of important points to be noted there. The rate of inflation, what we all are familiar with, that we all hear about on the news, is CPI, Consumer Price Index. The problem is that a Consumer Price Index inflationary number is what a consumer, an individual, pays when they go to the grocery store for a basket of groceries. And that number is produced every year by the Department of Bureau and Labor Statistics. The State Revenue Commissioner is not bound by that. Additionally, House Bill 581 provides no guidance, no regulations for how the rate of inflation is determined. Right now we are all assuming it's CPI because that's what we are all used to seeing with inflationary upticks. But the State Revenue Commissioner, which by the way is a political appointee, can make decisions for themselves how they want to set that number, what factors, what variables they want to take into the equation. And that equation, that methodology can change year over year over year. And cities and counties really have no say in the matter or guidance to know, to be able to forecast what that's going to look like. So let's use the same property as the previous example. So we have the $100,000 base year value, we have the $10,000 market increase, the floating homestead exemption of $10,000. But let's assume that consumer price index in year 2 is 2%. That means that the new base year value, the new assessed value, becomes 102. And the homestead exemption is reduced by that same amount, $2,000. So instead of the homestead exemption being $10,000, it'll only be $8,000. And this will allow the city to capture that extra 2%, that extra inflationary amount in terms of assessments. And in year 3, we have that same $5,000, so the exemption would be $13,000. Again, $8,000 plus the $5,000. But we have to use the inflationary adjustment in year 3 also. And I'm going to use 1.96 because that somehow magically gets us back to 2,000. So now we have a new base value of 104. Again, the same inflationary increases. We have the floating homestead exemption of $11,000, taking off the 115. That gets us to the 104. So that's what you'll be paying your taxes on. You'll be paying your taxes on 104. This is the complex math equation that House Bill 581 created. Now, before you say, how are we going to keep track of this? This is not new. Floating homestead exemptions is not a new concept. In fact, there's been a floating homestead exemption in this very county since 2002? Thank you. Rachel's the queen of that. 2002. And in Fulton County, there's been one since 2004. There are these floating homestead exemptions exist on a local level, a lot of different places. So it's not hard to keep track of all this. Really what matters is establishing that base year value, and then the math really just kind of falls into place based on House Bill 581. Base year valuation, though, is very important. So we have to know how it's established. First is, if your home had a homestead exemption in 2024, base year valuation is that 2024 number. For purposes of House Bill 581, your 2024 assessed value is what will be your base year value. For homes first receiving an exemption in later years, so if a new home gets constructed after 2024, then it's the year that it can first receive this exemption. And typically that happens in the first year after it is completed. So let's say a permit is pulled in 2025, the building is finished in 2025. Normally the first year you can apply for a homestead exemption would be 2026. And the reason why is because we determine homestead exemptions on January 1st, 2026. And so it wouldn't have been eligible January 1st of 2025. Similar to other homestead exemptions, that value will be reset when the home is sold or when it's a substantial property change has occurred. Two things I want to note about this sentence. So you could have, in theory, the same home in the same subdivision that have different base year values based entirely upon when that property is sold. So for example, let's say I own a house. It's identical to Nikki's house. We live in the same subdivision. We bought the same year. We bought it for $200,000. 3 years later, I decide I'm going to move and I sell it for $250,000. The new owner is a $250,000 base value, but she's still $200,000. Identical properties. I would submit you have a uniformity problem there. But House Bill 581 doesn't account for that. Doesn't make any adjustments for anything. Really, the transaction, my selling the transaction, has no bearing whatsoever on Nikki's valuation. Whereas as it currently sets, every time I sell my house, it's going to impact my neighbors because that's a new comparable sale that the assessor can use. And as far as the substantial change, that's where if you apply for a building permit, you put an addition on, you finish a bathroom, and it has a marketable impact on your property. And of course, the tax assessor is aware of when building permits are issued, so they'll be able to know when something has triggered a possible change. And homeowners cannot transfer the exemption to a new property. You can't take it with you. Your new property would have to be the one that you would be able to apply for this exemption for. Impact on other exemptions. So this is I want to dispel a myth People say that if we opt out, we are taking away homestead exemptions. That is not true at all. If the city decides to opt out, the only thing that is being decided is this floating homestead exemption. It does not replace the present homestead exemption that exists in Barrow County. It does not repeal or replace any special exemptions that you may be eligible for, senior citizen exemptions, public safety employee or teacher exemptions, depending on where you live. But the decision to opt out does not impact whatsoever any other non-floating homestead exemptions. So if there is already a local floating homestead exemption, as there is in Barrow County, the taxpayer is always going to receive whichever exemption is more beneficial. They get the benefit of the greater tax savings. As I said, in Barrow County, there already is this floating homestead exemption, and I will just go ahead and tell you, the Barrow County homestead exemption that you have right now will always be better than this House Bill 581 exemption. Why is that true? Because the Barrow County floating homestead exemption does not have an inflationary adjustment component. House Bill 581 does. So you will always be, paying an increased amount year over year because of an allowance in House Bill 581 that allows taxing authorities to move up using that CPI or that inflationary number. Barrow County doesn't have that. So something to be mindful of, that the decision to opt in versus opt out, really, as far as county taxes go, it's kind of a non-issue, really. Existing local exemptions, such as senior exemptions, like I said, are still be in place, and you will be able to actually add them on top of this exemption. You can stack those exemptions. So this is, again, in addition to, not in lieu of anything that's already there. So let's talk about the net effect on assessments and taxation. This is where I try to distill it down into common layman's terms. The bottom line of House Bill 581 and the floating homestead exemption: the taxable value of a home may only increase at a rate of inflation each year. That single sentence summarizes the net effect. All that complex math distilled into a single sentence for you. A homeowner who applies for and receives county and city homestead exemptions will automatically receive this exemption. So you go apply for your homestead exemption. This is a statewide automatic thing. There's no special paperwork, no special determination or anything like that. However, this may impact what exemptions local jurisdictions offer in the future. And what I mean by that is, because this is a mandate from the state, local exemptions have been designed and offered, and revenue projections for these various jurisdictions have been set based upon what the local offerings are, if you will. Because this new homestead exemption is being thrown on top, they may have to take away in the future exemptions that they already offer for no other reason than to make sure that budgets are balanced and what have you, that enough revenue is received to fund government operations. Non-homesteaded properties will continue to be valued at their fair market value like normal. So the burden for this, and I'll add a statement here. Obviously, cities and counties that have more residential properties are going to be disproportionately impacted than other jurisdictions that have large commercial, industrial, and agricultural tax bases. What do I mean by that? The focus of, because there's an artificial ceiling, and because millage rates increasing, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, are not favored, it means that governments are naturally going to put more emphasis on taxing commercial, industrial, and agricultural properties that don't qualify for these exemptions. But mathematically, there's this concept of embedded or hidden taxes that is being paid out of somebody's pocket. So for small business owners, let's say I have a business in a shopping center. Okay, let's say I lease space in the shopping center up Atlanta Highway. And let's say that my tax bill has gone up as a result of House Bill 581 as a business. Well, businesses don't pay taxes. They increase their prices, and the consumers pay those taxes. The small business is nothing more than a middleman. I'm sorry that sometimes is a politically controversial statement. It's a mathematical reality. Because if they got to pay the taxes, they got to raise the funds to do it somehow, and the only way that a business can raise funds is to sell their products at a certain rate. Since the floating homestead exemption slows the growth in the value of residential homesteaded properties, it will naturally create upward pressure on the millage rate. Again, we get back to that two-part formula. If there's a ceiling for factor number one, if there's a need for additional tax revenue, the only way that a city or a county can receive that revenue would be to increase the millage rate. Because again, House Bill 581 does not impact the ability of a city, or it doesn't cap what a millage rate can be. So, and the other thing I will point out is it's going to get, the impact of House Bill 581 grows with time. Let's use my example. Remember in my example, there's $15,000 over 2 years of growth that could be used to realize additional tax revenue. But because of House Bill 581, 11,000 of that is ineligible. Well, the only way to raise additional monies to provide the level of services that the citizens would expect would be to increase the millage rate. It's the only avenue that they have for raising those. Now, Rachel will point about 4 other options, but the reality is that those have certain ceilings to them. So the pressure on the millage rate will be there. Questions so far? I'm actually cruising here. All right, so is the new homestead exemption mandatory? If the governing authority does nothing, the answer is yes. The new floating homestead exemption becomes binding until it is changed by the General Assembly. But any governing authority may elect to opt out of the floating homestead exemption created by House Bill 581 by following a procedure that you may already be familiar with. Whenever a city decides it wants to increase its millage rate or adopt a millage rate that's higher than the rollback rate, they're required to advertise and have public hearings and make it very public, okay? There's no hiding the ball when it comes to millage rates. This House Bill 581 has a very similar procedure, which is 3 meetings, notice in the paper, and then a vote. I do want to highlight that second bullet point because I'm going to dispel another myth. The wording of the notice that you saw in the paper, the notice of intent to opt out, that makes it sound like the decision has already been made. That is patently not true. No decision has been made. In fact, if a decision could be made tonight, or it could be continued to another date. But the wording of the press release, the wording of the notice in the paper, the General Assembly said you have got to say it this exact way. You are not allowed to deviate a single word from this. So they wanted it to look like the decision was already made. So with all due respect to the General Assembly, they wanted it to make it look like the bad guys had already met behind closed doors and made a decision. That's simply not true. There's a reason why these public hearings are happening. There's a reason why I have now been speaking for 2 hours on this very topic in the city of Statham. That's combined over 3 meetings. But we do, as of right now, and I'm going to get to the House Bill 92 at the very end of this presentation. As we sit here right now, the election to opt in or opt out must be made by March 1st. And if the decision is to opt out, we must file a resolution and all the supporting materials. It must be in the hands of the Secretary of State by March 1st, 2025. That means we have a deadline of next Friday. We have until next Friday, not just to make the decision, but to make the decision, gather all the necessary paperwork, and make sure that it is in the hands of the Secretary of State. Is the decision to opt out or stay in permanent? Yes, but that's an oversimplification. So once the opt-out period is passed, if we've done nothing, we are in, and there is no future method for opting out. That decision is once and for all and final. If the decision is to opt out, however, there's no method to go into House Bill 581 floating homestead exemption, but as I mentioned, these are not new. These have existed for some time. And at any time, we could go to the local delegation and say, we changed our minds, we want to implement a local floating homestead exemption, maybe that's similar, maybe that's a little more tailored to our local jurisdiction, and adopt it that way. It's not unheard of. As I said, we've done it in Barrow County before. So that's the exemption. Now let's talk about the sales tax changes. So another controversial financial political statement. With every tax cut, there has to be a funding mechanism. You have to find a way to raise revenues in order to offset the loss of tax revenue that was received. I don't know how I did that. I'm with a mouse, but so be it. The way that they decided to fund this one was through a new sales tax. The first thing that they did that's not a part of this presentation is they revised this statute, 4886, which puts certain limits on what sales taxes and a total amount of sales taxes a jurisdiction may levy. So you have your local sales tax that everybody pays when they go to the grocery store. You have your SPLOST that we adopt every 6 years. You have your E-SPLOST that goes only to schools. There's T-SPLOSTs in Jackson County, not in Barrow County, but there's I'm sorry, there is in Barrow County, not in Jackson County. The other way around, flip that. Sorry. There were caps on the total number. They relieved that so that they could adopt this, what we call a FLOST, or a floating local option sales tax. It creates this new sales tax, and it's contingent upon jurisdictions having what they call a base year value homestead exemption or a floating homestead exemption. So what do I mean by it's contingent? We're going to get into that. New sales tax up to 1 penny for the limited purpose of tax relief. So just like a SPLOST, you have to use that money for a specific purpose, building roads, building bridges, sewer pipes, things like that, or an E-SPLOST has to go to schools. The revenues realized from this property tax, or I'm sorry, the sales tax has to go to reduce the millage rate a city imposes every single year. So Rachel will explain how we kind of back into the millage rate. The millage rate is kind of the last factor we come up with when it comes to funding local government. We take all the different revenue streams available to the city, not impact fees, license fees, all these things. I'll let her explain it more. But this property tax has to be considered before you get to your millage rate. This is very important. To be eligible for this tax, every single city in Barrow County and the county itself must have a floating homestead exemption in place. Every single one. That means if any one city opts out, everyone is ineligible for this floating local option sales tax. So if one opts out, all of a sudden our ability to receive this revenue disappears. And the quote-unquote funding mechanism for this House Bill 581 tax cut goes the way of the dodo bird. And that will just, again, further increase the pressure on the millage rate. Because, again, that becomes now the only mechanism that a city has to increase revenue to fund the operations and the services of the city. Like I said, if any opt out, all are ineligible. So how is it implemented? Let's talk about the politics of it real quick. So we start by the cities and the county, the cities representing 50% of the municipal population, and the county have to enter into an intergovernmental agreement calling for the tax. Just like a SPLOST, that IGA has to specify the rate, the duration, and the distribution between the counties. The duration cannot be more than 5 years. The distribution between the county and the cities, like I have said delicately, that's always a fun one because the cities and the county have never truly seen eye to eye on how those funds are supposed to be distributed. It's always very acrimonious and very tense. And it's not always fair to all concerned, if you don't mind me editorializing a little bit. Then it has to go to the voters for a public referendum. So every 5 years, the voters have to vote to reimpose that 1 penny sales tax. At the end of that, we have to go through local legislation, a new intergovernmental agreement, a new negotiation, and a new vote. So this lost, respectfully, is speculative in nature. It hinges upon all of the political parties getting together, not political parties, all the governmental parties getting together and agreeing on all the terms, and then the voters approving it. Well, there's only so much we like to pay in sales taxes every year, respectfully. And I've seen way too many various SPLOSTs not pass to ever consider them a sure thing. And in all reality, you're having to vote to tax yourself just so you can get a tax cut in another area. It's like taking money out of this pocket and putting it in that pocket. That's really what all this is. So how are funds from the new sales tax used? Again, they must be used for property tax relief. The funds have to be used for maintenance and operations budgets, so you can't build police stations, you can't buy parks with them. It's just maintenance and operations, just paying salaries and funding the general operations of government. Basically the general fund, if you're familiar with that in the budgeting process. And each taxpayer's bill has to state the amount by which the property tax has been reduced because of the imposition of this tax. So mathematical formula, it can be done. It's just something you'll see every year. Say, oh, we collected this much in taxes, and therefore if we apply it, distill it down to an individual taxpayer, this is how much you saved. Let's talk quickly about rollback rates. So this is a nerd slide, but it's interesting for me from a legal perspective. So this concept of a rollback rate, it was created by the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It was passed back in 1998, that says, so every year there's a millage rate. We set a millage rate in base year 1 for the examples that I used previously. Because properties, generally speaking, appreciate in value, if there's no market fallout, it's going to go up incrementally, right? If we applied the same millage rate to your properties year over year, you'd be paying more in taxes, because 5 mills on $100,000 versus 5 mills on $110,000, you're going to get more money from the 5 mills on 110, right? So the point, a rollback rate is published and advertised every year. That is the rate that somebody would, that is the rate that you would assess on the increased number to arrive at the same tax revenue year over year. So here's your example. The city establishes a millage rate of 5 mills, resulting in $1 million in taxes. Year 2, because of property value increases, the same millage rate would generate $1.1 million in taxes. So instead, you only need 4.75 mills to generate that same $1 million in revenue. Your rollback rate is 4.75. Because of the artificial ceiling that has been put by House Bill 581, the delta, the spread between the millage rate and the rollback rate has naturally shrunk. It's a mathematical reality. But that doesn't look good, because we've all, since 1998, become accustomed to seeing large spreads between millage rates and rollback rates. So how do we get that delta back up? How do we widen that back out to make it more familiar? House Bill 581 caps the increase, so it shrinks. And if the city receives the flossed proceeds, guess what? It stretches back out. Now all of a sudden you don't need as much property taxes to make your budget, and your rollback rate spreads back out. There's a larger gap between the millage rate and the rollback rate. But again, all of this presumes the flossed is in place and we are collecting flossed revenues. If that's not there, then the rollback rate is going to, like I said, shrink over time. Some procedural tax changes that you need to be aware of. So again, it creates this estimated rollback rate. On your assessments right now, when you get your assessments in April, you see what the new value is, all right? And then it assumes a flat millage rate, and then you see what your taxes are going to be. And so you'll be able to tell year over year whether you're going to pay more or less taxes. Now, the House Bill 581 requires that we have to put an estimated rollback rate certified by the tax commissioner on your tax bill. It's on your notice. So you're going to see that rollback rate earlier in the process than you're accustomed to seeing it, because normally it comes out during the millage rate setting period for the local government. Now they want us to do estimates on that sooner, and so your assessment notice is going to look a little bit different. If the adopted millage rate exceeds the estimated rollback rate, then we have to put a disclaimer on your tax bill naming the evil government that exceeded the estimated rollback rate, resulting in an increase of taxes. I hate to say this, but the game of politics in today's world is almost as much about creating enemies as it is, or creating villains is probably the better way, as it is about solving problems. And this is one of those creating villain components. Other changes, it modifies the 3-year lock for appeals. You may be familiar with the idea of if you appeal and you receive, if you appeal, you can lock your property value in for a 3-year period. Now you can only do that. You only get your lock if a value reduction occurs as part of that appeal. It also updates some of the requirements for settlement conferences between the appealing party and the tax assessor. And finally, it requires by law that the chief appraiser must appraise every parcel in the county at least every 3 years. I actually stated something inaccurate, and I want to correct it. Last time I said that Barrow County, that's averaging about every 2 years. I spoke with them. They are confident they do it every year. They say they meet every year. This will be no change, no issue whatsoever. This is really more for small local or small jurisdictions that the appraiser, the chief appraiser, assessor, shall we say, is not a full-time position, so they usually just come along every 2 or 3 years to do it. But now it has to happen every 3 years. So policy considerations for local governments. This is the things you have to think about when you're deciding whether to opt in or to opt out. Number one, will the cost of goods and services outpace CPI and inflation? I asked this question, I put it this way. Consumer price index inflation that we know is, like I said, the price consumers pay for a basket of groceries. Okay, how much does that increase year over year, quarter over quarter? Problem is that the city is not a consumer. The city isn't buying bread and milk at a grocery store. The city is buying asphalt. The city is buying pipes. The city is paying for those types of services. And generally speaking, the cost of those goods and services outpaces inflation. So in our last inflationary cycle where we were experiencing 8, 9, 10% inflation for consumers, cities were experiencing inflation rates closer to 30 and 40%. Because the price of pipes, sewer pipes, asphalt, that went through the roof. Now, I can tell you exactly who's at fault for that. It was government spending, because as soon as the government started funding all these public works projects, guess what? There's a flood of cash, and everybody's like, oh, we can raise our prices, because guess what? They've got the money to pay for it. So just understand that with the uncertainty surrounding how the rate of inflation is calculated by the State Revenue Commissioner, that's relevant. Do we have confidence that they're going to get it right so that we don't feel the pinch more than we anticipate? Taxes do not necessarily decrease. I'll just tell you this. If anybody told you that House Bill 581 guaranteed you a tax decrease, that was disingenuous and dishonest. It only shifts the taxes, okay? It shifts it off of residential properties and onto commercial, industrial, and agricultural, and it changes the mechanism by which tax increases may or may not happen. Digest versus millage rate. And Rachel is going to show you an example showing that your taxes are still going to go up. The only thing House Bill 581 is it decreases the amount by which they go up. So pay attention to that. Obviously, flossed eligibility in other jurisdictions matter. Other cities are considering opting out, Winder, Auburn, Brazelton. I want to focus on Brazelton real quick. What's that? Well, you should care about other cities, because if they opt out, we don't get a flossed, and we can't fund this tax decrease. It only takes one. And again, I want to focus on Brazelton. Brazelton specifically is very important to this equation. The reason why they're a domino, a major domino to fall, because Brazelton is located in 4 counties: Hall, Jackson, Barrow, and Gwinnett. Jackson County already has 2 jurisdictions that have opted out: Pendergrass and Arcade. Therefore, Brazelton is ineligible for a flossed, meaning Brazelton has no incentive to stay in. So if Brazelton opts out, every single Gwinnett County, Hall County, Jackson County, and Barrow County, they're all out. So other cities' decisions to stay in or to opt out has impacts on that flossed, which is, again, a critical component to this legislation. It's something the General Assembly put there for a reason, because it's the only way, frankly, to make the math work in a lot of places. The floating homestead exemption would apply to special service districts. We don't have one here in Statham, but we do have the ability to create one in Statham, so I'm going to mention this. So in our ordinances, Code of Ordinances, we have the ability to say if there is a particular development that is specifically impactful, we have the ability to require the creation of a special tax district where the people or the properties within that district pay additional taxes through up to 3 mills more than properties outside of it. Let me give you an example of this. And this is one of the reasons why Arcade opted out, In Arcade, they're a town of 1,800 people. Residents, not properties, 1,800 residents total. There are 2 residential projects that have been approved, that have been permitted, and dirt is moving, that will increase the property by 6,000 homes. It will effectively triple or quadruple the size of the city. And because of those new properties and those new residents coming online, the demands on services like fire and police protection go through the roof. Well, it's not fair for the 1,800 that are there presently and have a certain level of services that can fund it to have to pay the freight for those more police officers, more firefighters, and what have you, caused by this new growth. So by requiring these special service districts, it allows the city to push more of the financial burden on the people that caused the financial obligation. But because this homestead exemption applies everywhere uniformly, it means that they're going to get the benefit of this exemption, so it decreases that 3 mils effectively. Just something to be mindful of, especially when you have a large property like the Walton Tract that could this could be potentially applicable to. And remember, the homestead exemption can be added later by local act. All right, this slide got added about 2 seconds before I got up here, but I wanted to bring it up. So there is pending legislation, House Bill 92. It was introduced this year because the cities, generally speaking, especially in the rural areas where there's mostly residential homesteaded properties, there was a pretty quick mathematical exercise done, and they realized, holy cow, this is not going to work for everybody, and it's certainly not going to work for us. There was a large movement of cities opting out and municipalities opting out, especially considering the very short time frame that the General Assembly gave us. They gave us 2 months to figure this out, realistically. And so House Bill 92 would extend the opt-out period to May 1st. It would give us 2 additional months to do whatever we thought was appropriate to consider. It is still pending in the House. It was reported favorably out of the House Ways and Means Committee on February the 5th, but it has not been voted on. It has not crossed over to the Senate. It has to clear both. It has to be voted on in both and signed by the governor, and it all has to be done by March 1st, within the next 2 weeks, or else we may be waiting too long and miss our window. So if you wanted to, you could decide to table this decision to a later date, but it would require a special called meeting, and understand that in doing so, you are eating away at your cushion. Why do you need a cushion? Because it's more than just signing a resolution and sending it down there. You have to sign the resolution, you have to compile publisher's affidavits, you have to make sure that you show and demonstrate that you have complied with all of the statutory requirements. And if all your T's are crossed and all your I's are not dotted, they could reject it. And it has to be received and accepted by March 1st. So you're eating away at your ability to correct any mistakes. But it is an option for you, and I did want you to be aware of where House Bill 92 is, because I've heard some people say, no, you've got more time. No, you don't. You may have some more time, but that's not a sure thing as we sit here right now. What time is it, Nikki? Nailed it. Less than 47 minutes. Faster than the last 2 times. Any questions? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to put some actual math together on this. Yeah. Sure.
Any cities in Barrow County opted out already?
I am not aware of any cities that have actually voted yet
Okay.
in Barrow County. I do think, I have heard that Auburn and Winder are going to do special called meetings.
Yes,
They're gonna hold out hope that they got more time. But with all due respect, I don't know how more time changes the math. I think at some point it just delays it may increase political pressure as time goes on, but the simple reality is the math is the math. And the math is not changed. House Bill 92 does not make any changes to the mathematical formula created by House Bill 581. So again, for me, respectfully, it's just delaying the inevitable. All yours. Oconee County opted out? Yes, sir. Yeah, okay, well, we know Oconee County's opted out. And last thing I didn't mention, school boards. Every single school board in the state of Georgia is opting out. There's a reason for that. The reason why is because unlike cities and counties, school boards, by Georgia Constitution, have a cap on their millage rates. So variable 2, there's already a ceiling for them. By putting a ceiling on variable 1, you have now created a ceiling forever on what the maximum amount of taxes they can collect on. And that's frankly untenable for schools. So, all your
All right, good evening, Mayor and Council. Let's see, get myself poised up here. So Jody did a good job explaining what House Bill 581 is from a macro level, what the bill says and what it means. I'm gonna tone it down into City of Statham dollars, what it means to your revenues and your expenditures and how we balance the budget, and a tangible realization as to what it means for you as a taxpayer in the City of Statham. The mechanism I'm going to use to explain it is your fiscal year 25 budget. It's the most current and present financial report that I can give you to explain the impact of what House Bill 581 means. So,
Yeah, so we do this.
it worked last week.
Is your mouse on?
Yeah, I'm able to navigate. It's just weird it's not clicking.
I got it.
Okay, well, I'm on the right slide, so we're good. We'll work with it. I'm flexible. So we're going to start with talking about your fiscal year 25 budget. We're going to start on the revenue side, and then we'll flip over to the expenditure side. But what I want to focus on here is the breakdown of your revenues by category. This is per the DCA chart of accounts and broken down by revenue category. And what I want to highlight here is your top 3 revenue streams. Your real and personal property taxes make up almost $968,000 or 29.5% of the revenues in your general fund budget. Your general fund is your city's main operating fund. This is what supports your maintenance and operations. Real and personal property taxes is followed by your sales tax, which is your loss at 19.8%, and transfers from other funds at 21.3%. What I want to focus on is your general fund is primarily supported by 3 revenue streams. Your real and personal property taxes, which are the point of discussion today, your sales tax, and your transfers from other funds. And we'll talk about how that relates from a regional and local perspective here in just a moment. You mind? So we've talked about monies that are coming into the general fund. Let's talk about where we spend those monies coming out of the general fund. You'll note that the police department that provides your community's public safety is the largest use of general fund resources, with a total combined amount of about $1.5 million. Or 46% of the general fund budget. One thing I want to correct from the last presentation slide is the Public Works Department percentage. The amount is right, but the percentage on the slide was wrong. So I want to make sure I update that. The next largest, or the second largest percentage in your general fund use of resources is your Public Works Department, and that includes your roads and streets. That's about $679,000, or about 21% of your general fund budget. And this is followed by your 3rd largest department of general administration, which includes your city hall staff, at about $515,000, or 15.7% of your general fund budget. So what's important and worth noting here is that those 3 departments make up 84, almost 85% of your general fund budget. So we'll talk about what House Bill 581 does from a impact to this, but I can tell you without any uncertainty at all that House Bill 581 will impact the amount that you are able to spend on your police department, public works, roads and streets, and general administration. Okay, and we'll look at what that looks like. So We're going to talk about how we arrive at your property tax revenue number and then in turn your millage rate. And as Jody mentioned, this is not an arbitrary number. We come about your property tax numbers in a very thoughtful approach. And what that means is that property tax bills really should fundamentally be determined by spending levels. And what I mean by that is that our budget should back into our property tax revenue amount and in turn our millage rate. So what we decide is through the budget development process, we determine what our spending level needs to be. We say these are the level of services we want to provide, i.e. a full-time police department, a community center. This is the level of service we want to provide, and we assign a cost to that. And I'm part of that. I develop your revenue forecast, and I assign costs to the service levels that we provide here at the City of Statham. And so we take all those service levels and we say, this is the dollar amount assigned to the cost of providing that service level. And then we take and we back off any revenues that are outside of property taxes. Sales tax, license and permits, financial institutions tax, rental revenues, franchise fees, any revenue that we can generate outside of property taxes. We attempt to do that at fullest abilities. And then we back that off what that cost of services is. And what we're left with is our shortfall or our gap. And that we have to make up with property tax revenues. So that's how we arrive at what our property tax revenue level needs to be. And then we calculate millage rate from that. Okay, and this is never a one and done. I will assure you that we don't come up to the cost and say, well, this is the cost of spending levels, this is the property tax revenue we need, and let's just go with it. 9 times out of 10, we get to this point and we say, ooh, we can't do that. We can't achieve this level of service because it costs too much. And we can't bear that burden on our property taxpayers. So we go back to our department heads, like our dear police chief, and we say, let's talk about needs versus wants. What's a need versus a want? Can we whittle this number down at all to reduce this burden on our property taxpayers? And so there's a lot of back and forth with our department heads until we can finally get to a number where we say, okay, let's calculate this property tax impact on our citizens. And that's the next calculation that we're going to talk about. So now that we've identified our shortfall, and this is a real example from our fiscal year 25 budget, we identified our desired level of spending was $3.2 million plus some debt service. We backed off our revenues that were lost and, sales tax and court fines and everything else we could. Transfers from revenues, and we identified our shortfall in the general fund of $844,000. We take our digest, say, okay, what does our millage rate have to be to get to that number, to fill that gap? And that's where we landed on 6.76 mils. So if you look on the right-hand side, this revisits that property tax calculation that Jody talked about. We have assessed value, variable number 1, our millage rate, variable number 2, and you take those two things, that equates to your property tax levy, or the amount of taxes due. We can look at a micro level, a homeowner level, and say a $100,000 home, assessed value at 6.7 mils equates to 676 in property taxes due. The same way you as a homeowner calculate your property taxes, we in turn at the macro level calculate the city's property taxes. And so we say all of the properties in the city of Statham are worth that $133 million. We apply the millage rate, and that calculates a total tax levy of $900,000. We do a collection rate of 98%, and we get to our revenue. So that's our property tax calculation, and as Jody spoke to earlier, if you change one of those variables, but you don't change the end, what you're solving for, the other has to increase to compensate for that, right? So if we have assessed value times millage rate equals property tax, and you cap this, but you don't change what your spending level is, then your millage rate is just going to increase to compensate for that capped variable, right? So that's what's important about this calculation and how it impacts, House Bill 581 impacts this calculation. So I mentioned we would just talk about how our property tax level equates to others. This is just a little caveat to say we're mindful of our local area and we're mindful of our state and how we measure up to our neighbors, so to speak. So this is just a quick slide to say we took a temperature check of what the state of Georgia is, and the property tax burden on the average state of Georgia is 27.1. Here in the city of Statham, it's 29.5. And then you can see in the gray box that there is a comparison to some local jurisdictions as well as some other kind of surrounding areas. And this is just to be mindful that we want to always reduce the property tax burden on our property tax owners, but we also want to be mindful of where we are in terms of our neighboring cities as well. I will not talk about House Bill 581 because Jody did an excellent job explaining the nuances of that. But I do think it's worth going through another example. It's structured a little differently, same meat and potatoes that Jody presented, but I'm a numbers gal and I focus a little bit more on a tabular numbers approach versus Jody's words approach. I favor numbers, so we're going to run through a little example of pre-House Bill 581 and post-House Bill 581. So on the left side of your screen is pre-House Bill 581. You own a home valued at $250,000 on the market. Here in the state of Georgia, that assessed value is $100,000 or 40%. We also have a homestead exemption should you be eligible, $2,000. So your taxable value is $98,000. Here in the city of Statham, we apply a millage rate of 6.76, so your taxes due in 2024 are $662. Fast forward, now we have House Bill 581. Should we opt out of House Bill 581, the top half is true. You experience a 10% market value increase, and now your home is worth $275,000. The same 40% assessed value in the state of Georgia gives you $110,000. The same homestead exemption, because remember this doesn't mess with your homestead exemptions, gives you $108,000 taxable value, millage rate of 6.76. Your new property tax due in 2025 is an increase of about $68 to $730. With House Bill 581 in effect, we have a CPI example here of an inflationary factor of 3.5%. So what's different here is that we now have a floating homestead exemption of $6,570. And what that does is guarantees that our taxable value is no more than that inflationary factor of 3.5%. Should the value have increased beyond $275,000, you would see that floating homestead exemption increase incrementally to ensure that the taxable value is no more than 3.5%. Okay, so this is how the floating homestead exemption works. So in this example, this taxpayer saved about $44 this year due to House Bill 581. Okay, now I think it's really important, especially from a finance professional, to look at two sides of the coin, right? There's always another side of the coin. So we've looked at it from a taxpayer side. Let's look at it from the impact of how it relates to your community. So we ran an analysis. We did a 5-year projection of what would happen with House Bill 581 and what would happen without House Bill 581. So in step 1, we calculated an average. So I looked historically back 5 years and annualized a 5-year historical average of 11.39%. Then step 2, we project that forward. And we say with no changes, things currently as they are, no House Bill 581, that average projected 5 years forward equates to about 5.9, almost 6 million in tax revenue over that 5-year period. For comparison purposes, I take that same 11.39 and project it out over the 5 years for every category except residential homestead. When I take that residential homestead and I cap it at 3 and 3.5% for this projection. With that cap, we can project 5-year revenues to be about $5 million. So what that means is from a revenue loss, tax years for that 5-year period is about $867,000. And you can see that compound year after year, and that's the point of that chart there. As you can see that it starts out in a smaller difference, and over time, that exponentially grows because it's compounded year after year after year after year. That disparity is going to continue to increase. So, Councilmember Patterson, you asked me in not the last public hearing, but the public hearing before that, I thought was a really important question. You said, so the taxpayer saves $44, but the city loses $867. And that wasn't a fair statement because the $44 is year one. And the $867 is a 5-year span. So what I did was take that same $44 in savings and extrapolate it over that same 5-year period for the city versus the taxpayer. So if we were to compare those two things, that's what you have here on this impact comparison. The impact to the taxpayer over that 5-year period is about $271. The impact to your city and your community is $867,000. I think that speaks volumes. I'd like to remind you that 84% of your budget goes to public safety and public works. There is no way this $1 million will not impact the level of services that you receive in those areas. Okay? So where do we go from here? It thought about it. All right, here we go. Sorry for the technical difficulty. So what can the city of Statham do? You have a couple of options. You can opt out and continue existing levy and collection practices. You can opt out and identify and implement a local homestead exemption to address state and community concerns that address your local community. You can proceed with implementing House Bill 581, but that's going to come with a couple of repercussions. One, you'll either have to raise the millage rate to produce the same level of property tax revenues, or cut programs or services to offset the property tax shortfall that will come with House Bill 581. 3 and 4 is you can identify and establish new or examine and strengthening existing revenue streams to offset the shortfall. Although I can assure you that your administration is actively and aggressively doing those things now, so I'm not sure how much more we can do, keeping in mind that those things are limited as a local government, or a combination of all 4 of those things to offset the impact of House Bill 581. There is no question that you will see an impact of services if we do not meet this property tax shortfall with some funding mechanism. As Jody mentioned, floss is off the table for us here in Barrow County. So without a doubt, there will have to be a funding mechanism or an alternative cut in service levels. It is a simple mathematical formula. I would also encourage council and mayor to think about the inequities that are repercussions, I think, beyond the scope of what we've entertained here and in the House bill in terms of your neighbors having 2 very drastically different property tax bills and what that might lead to and other ramifications such as that. But that's where my finance impact leaves you, and I welcome any questions from the floor. Council?
No. Very good.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Mayor, if I may, I have some updates and some corrections I need to make
Okay.
So while we were listening to Rachel's presentation, I emailed some friends and I received the following information. There are 3 things I want to update you on that were inaccurate in what I presented earlier. Number 1, Brazelton has voted to table the consideration. So they have postponed their decision to, and they haven't set a special called meeting date yet. The stated reason why is they are going to try to let House Bill 92 play out. Second, an amended version of House Bill 92 was reported out of the Ways and Means Committee today. That amended version changes the opt-out period, not to May, to March of 2029, 4 years from now. Meaning you can stay in and opt out anytime over the next 4 years. Reading the tea leaves, I think that what they have decided is they want to let cities experiment and make the decisions later. Finally, and this is what happened today, the House voted and has immediately transmitted it to the Senate. So it is now in the Senate's hands for voting. It will have to go through the 3-reader process. So the earliest that they could vote on it would probably be, I'll read it tomorrow, Thursday, Friday. They'd either vote Friday or Monday. And then it would have to go to the governor to be signed. So it is mathematically possible now. But it would mean that we'd have to, if for some reason it hit a roadblock, it would have to fly through the Senate and no amendments pass as presented. But it is at least on track. So there is a possibility at this point. So those are 3 corrections that I wanted to make sure that y'all were aware of before y'all made any decisions.
Thank you, Jody.
Thank you.
I'm not going to tell you what a good or not a good possibility is under the gold dome. That's, if I can project that, I'd go buy a lottery ticket. Yeah.
Does anybody want to come forward to speak on House Bill 581, for or against? Okay. Then I need a motion to come out of the public hearing.
Motion to come out of public hearing.
I'll second.
All in favor, show of hands. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Now we'll go to our voting items. 1862 Railroad Street rezone application. Rob's not here?
Rob is not here, and I'll just give you a little bit of information. That's why I ran out of here, so I could get what we've done thus far with this. September 17th, we made a motion to table. October 15th, we made a motion to table. And December 17th, we made a motion to table this. At this point, I don't know if we reached our table motions. And Jody, if we do not vote on it tonight, does it go into a 6-month? He would have to bring it back because we did 3 tables.
Yeah, we did 3 tables. Now, here's the thing. The 3-table rule is city-driven. There's nothing that prohibits the city from tabling again, but it requires the absolute consent of the applicant. The applicant can request as many tables as they want.
Right.
But since he's not here right now, we can't get that consent. So yes, that 6-month thing will be triggered.
Okay. So I know we've been going back and forth and with Mr. Scott on this past week. I don't know, it's up to the council at this point if they want to table it and push it back to, like we said, goes back to a 6-month. Or do you want to move forward and name the conditions? And I know we had a Q&A ready for Mr. Scott tonight for clarity of each of the concerns of point of condition. So that's what's on the table right now. You can table it, and Mr. Scott has a 6-month period where then he would have to come back and ask for the rezone. So you don't have to do anything tonight, but make a motion to table or to vote.
Yeah, I was hoping he'd be here to answer these conditions.
Yeah, that's very understandable. I mean, you are making a decision, or preparing to make a decision.
The only thing I would point out is we do have his response to the conditions. So
Okay.
really, there were 4 that he had suggestions on. You're welcome to accept his suggestions or vote the conditions. Y'all are the ultimate decider.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. I think I'm gonna make a motion to table it since Mr. Scott is not here.
Okay.
Just so we're clear, that means that
He has 6 months, so we're looking at August. If you can, I know, I'm using my fingers, y'all. August or September, I'd have to look at the reading of it. Full 6 months would be September. He could come back.
you wouldn't be eligible, you couldn't vote on it again until September. It's effectively a denial, and he has to reapply in 6 months. Yeah, just so you're aware.
We made a motion to table.
Yeah, I'll make a motion to table.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor? Motion carried.
Jody, is it a table? Is it
It's not a table, it's a denial.
Denial.
No, denial. It's a denial of the rezoning. A table effectuates a denial, de facto denial.
Yeah. You have to clean up the motion to say denial.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'll make a motion to,
Yeah, make a substitute motion to deny.
okay. I'll make a motion to deny.
I'll second that motion.
All in favor? Okay, motion carried. Second voting item is the purchase of additional police vehicles. Anybody want to make a motion to accept the purchase of the 3 police patrol vehicles? And I've got them listed here.
Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to approve the bid from John Meagle Ford, Cleveland, Georgia, 3 new police cars, fully outfitted and detailed for the amount of $192,496, with the funding coming from the Police Blue Line account.
That's good. I need a second. I'll second. All in favor, show of hands. Motion carries. So we're coming up on the vote for House Bill 581. What is the pleasure of the board? Need a motion.
Jody, in light of what you just found out, I'd like to make a motion to table this to the latest date that you think would be possible.
So we don't, on this one, I would just simply say,
No vote.
motion to postpone rather than a motion to table. That way
Okay.
we don't have to set a date, and I will just continue to monitor and update the
Okay.
council daily
Okay.
on its progress. And if we need to do a special call meeting next week, we'll
Okay.
obviously blast that out to the public
Yeah.
through all means possible.
Okay.
Can we already have the paperwork and everything if we do decide to opt out? Just,
He's already started compiling everything.
Okay.
I'll have a resolution drafted if we absolutely have to make a call.
okay.
Then
So
I'll make,
motion to postpone?
yeah, motion to postpone.
Need a second?
I'll second.
All in favor? Show of hands. Anyone against? Everybody's hands? I didn't see your hand. Okay, all right. Motion carries. Last one is the proclamation. So we're voting on the official proclamation for Arbor Day. So shall I read this and then vote, or just read the proclamation?
Yeah, I would read it before we vote. So
Okay.
we know what we're voting on.
Okay. In 1872, the Nebraska Board of Agriculture established a special day to set aside for the planting of trees and this holiday called Arbor Day. was first observed with the planting of more than 1 million trees in Nebraska, and Arbor Day is now observed throughout the nation and the world. And trees can be a solution of combating climate change by reducing the erosion of our precious topsoil by wind and water, cutting heating and cooling costs, moderating the temperature, cleaning the air, producing life-giving oxygen, and providing habitat for wildlife. And trees are a renewable resource giving us paper, wood for our homes, fuel for our fires, and countless other wood products. And trees in our city increase property values, enhance the economic vitality of business areas, and beauty our community. And trees, wherever they're planted, are a source of joy and spiritual renewal. I, Debbie Krause, Mayor of the City of Statham, do hereby proclaim Friday, February the 21st, 2025, as Arbor Day in the City of Statham, and I urge all citizens to celebrate Arbor Day and to support efforts to protect our trees and woodlands. And I urge all citizens to plant trees to gladden the heart and promote the well-being of this and future generations on this day, the 18th day of February, 2025.
I'll make a motion for the mayor to sign the proclamation proclaiming Arbor Day, February 21st, 2025.
I need a second. I'll second. All in favor, show of hands. Yay. All righty. So I need a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Motion to adjourn.
I need a second.
Frank.
Frank seconded. All in favor, show of hands. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you for coming, everybody.